Let's do it. Okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Joe Oliva. I work with GrowSmart Maine as the Outreach and Communications Director. But as is the way with small nonprofits, it's a little bit of everything, and data centers became a topic for our organization to look at over the last 8 months or so. Um, so this webinar is meant to help demystify maybe some of the questions that we all have collectively around data center development here in the state, but also talking about some of the national trends. And so just wanted to say that the landscape has shifted dramatically regarding data center development here in Maine. High energy costs were long assumed to be a barrier to their arrival in the state, but as proposals land on town and city council dockets, it's clear that Maine communities are no longer insulated from navigating the opportunities and challenges associated with these facilities. So the question that we ask today is, how can communities prepare themselves to approach planning and development decisions that balance a diverse array of local priorities? And what tools and resources are out there to build and implement a sound decision-making process, and which are necessary to create? Joining me today is Tony Pipa, Steve Clemmer, and Anja Collette. Tony is a senior fellow in the Center of Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. He launched and leads the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative and hosts the award-winning Reimagine Rural podcast. He incubated and facilitates America's Rural Future, the Brookings AEI Commission on U.S. Rural Prosperity, co-chaired by former Senator Heidi Heitkamp and former Governor Chris Sununu. The commission is visiting and engaging local rural leaders and residents across the country to review the effectiveness of current federal rural policy and publish a national rural strategy in the fall of 2027. As Director of Energy Research for the Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Energy Program, Steve Clemmer conducts research on the economic and environmental benefits of implementing renewable energy technologies and policies at the state and national levels. Steve led UCS's recent research analyzing the impacts of data centers, growing electricity demands on the U.S. power grid, and how decision makers can mitigate harmful economic, climate, and health impacts through clean energy development, strong ratepayer protections, and other safeguards. As a Maine resident for the past 17 years, Steve has actively been involved in advancing strong climate and clean energy policies, including serving on working groups for the state's Climate Action Plan and offshore winds roadmap, and advocating for strong utility grid planning at the Maine Public Utilities Commission. And Anja Collette is a planning professional with extensive experience in geographic information systems, otherwise known as GIS, and environmental planning. Currently serving as planning officer and previously as planning analyst for the city of Bangor since July 2021. Anja has played critical roles in project management and planning initiatives. That was a lot. Before we begin, we just want to thank our sponsors, Kennebec Savings Bank, for making this webinar possible. So with that, I'll toss it over to Tony to kick us off.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to GrowSmart and to you for convening this conversation, and thanks for having me. And so I thought I'd just start off with a little bit of a national perspective, and just to even say, why is this happening? And I think it's important that we're seeing all of these proposals for data centers, because at the national and global level, the race for artificial intelligence is just creating enormous pressure. It's enormous pressure on the market. So you have the key technology companies competing against each other. And frankly, there's an enormous geopolitical pressure as well, as the US really sees itself in a race against China, and sees winning that race as kind of existential for the future of our economy. And even to a certain extent, depending on who you talk to, they'll say it's sort of existential for Western values. And so where I sit in Washington, D.C., at the level of the national decision makers, like the most patriotic thing you can do is win this race. And so we just need to go as fast as possible. And the speed and the breadth of the acceleration really has been staggering. Just in this year alone, like the 5 largest U.S. tech companies have proposed a combined $720 billion in capital expenditures on this. And you saw the construction starts, the spending on construction starts went from a little over $5.5 billion in all of 2023, and then it had accelerated already to more than $43 billion in the first 10 months of 2025. So it's happening everywhere. It's the acceleration and the speed and the breadth of all of that has just really been very fast. AI itself just needs much more compute power. So that means not only more data centers, but it means larger data centers, much, much larger. I have a friend who does a presentation on this and takes the footprint of a data center that's being proposed in rural Louisiana and superimposes it on a map of New York City, and it takes up most of the Isle of Manhattan, right? So like the scope and the scale of the physical infrastructure is really large. And increasingly, that means the new proposals are landing in rural places because they have the space for that. And you can see that from Pew. Pew just did a short study that shows that change. We're actually underway on taking that study one level deeper. And it's interesting. While many of the new tracts meet the definition of rural developed by the Census Bureau, so you're at the census tract level, and you see a really large swing. You see a swing from about 18, 19% of the active data centers to the new data center proposals going to about 80% of rural census tracts. Most of them are still actually inside metropolitan statistical areas as defined by OMB. So they're smaller communities, they're rural in character, but they're still close to smaller, large cities. So they're ex-urban, if you will. But just the scale of the industrial development raises huge questions around the local management of resources. So the land itself, the land use planning, the need for power and electricity. Steve will talk a little bit about what that means, but many are building their own power plants to power the data centers, so it's off grid. But there's question about whether the infrastructure even exists. There's question about what will happen to electricity rates. The data centers need water. That's needed as a coolant. And so there's environmental concerns about emissions for the power. There's concerns about water runoff. There's concerns about what will happen to the water table. If you're living nearby, there's light pollution, noise pollution, maybe a complete change in your view shed. And simply, I think communities are grappling with it as a change in their way of life. And certainly for those near it, a change in the potential quality of their life. And so there's all of these risks. And I will say, there is a growing awareness of all of these, but local officials themselves, like this is coming at them very quickly and as a tsunami. And so even getting up to speed on what the questions are to ask and how to grapple with some of these issues, because it's not as if many communities have planned for this to happen. And so they're faced with decisions on a very abrupt and quick timeline. There's a great short piece just put out by Deborah Stein that was created out of a workshop by Innovate US on the questions that local public officials should be asking themselves. I'll pop that in the chat after I'm done speaking. But it goes through a lot of those risk factors and how to be thinking about them when a proposal comes your way. I would say one thing that's actually missing from those 10 things public officials should know, that piece, is the risk of stranded assets. I've talked to a lot of local folks who say, we're building this footprint now because of the state of the technology and where it is now, but could there be advances in technology and AI processing, then will we need and use this entire build out for the future? And there's competing opinions on that, frankly. So there's also, how you try to manage that particular risk. Having said that, what are the upsides? A lot of folks focus on the jobs. And there definitely will be construction jobs in the short term as you have to build this. Question on that from my perspective is whether those are going to be local or imported. And you can almost have a boom or a bust kind of economy if you've got outside people coming in for those jobs. And frankly, the permanent jobs are much more modest. They're nothing on the order of what you might expect if you were opening a similar size manufacturing plant with the same footprint. And while it's a data center and many people think, lots of technology jobs, actually a lot of the jobs are not technology related. They're more facility oriented jobs, security or building maintenance. I have Brookings colleagues who just did research showing that the places that have seen the increase in tech related jobs due to data centers are really where there's more like several campuses or data centers together. Like if you've just got a one-off, or it tends not to have a big impact on the local labor market in terms of technology types of jobs. I would say the real potential upside is revenue, property and sales tax, school taxes, other community development investments that you might negotiate with the developer. The flip side to that is many communities are reducing or giving away those via tax incentives or abatements. Community benefits agreement are something that I think many communities are thinking about could be a way to ensure that they're getting the investment that they need, as something that's proportional to the investment coming in. Also have some resources just on a primer around CBAs, and what it would take. But again, that becomes also tricky because communities need time to think through what would be the best, what they would agree on as the best community benefits to come in. And so you need a community engagement process to go through that if you're going to feel credible. But just to end my opening from the national perspective, just as quickly as this is accelerating and happening all across the country, is as swiftly as local resistance is increasing. And there was a Gallup poll that was released just within the past couple of weeks that literally had a staggering 71% of people opposed to a data center going into near where they live. And it cuts across political lines when you look at the projects that have been rejected. People are concerned about it changing their way of life, the nature of their own community in a physical way. They're concerned all about those risks that I just laid out. But frankly, they're also concerned about AI overall, just as a concept and a thing that might be changing who we are as a society and as a country overall. And they are really pushing back against what they see as a lack of transparency. Many times, local officials are asked to engage with the developers under confidentiality agreements, and then it feels to the community like it's being presented with a deal that's pretty much done, and they kind of have a limited sense of agency over their own future. So I think the bottom line from the national point of view is, especially rural communities where I do a lot of my work, they have a lot of experience with industrial development coming in and being extractive in the end, where the investment comes from the outside, and then a lot of that value flows outside, and less of the wealth and assets remain behind. And so I think the question that I would just leave us with is the challenge is to ensure that a data center development doesn't end up being parasitic, but it becomes somehow mutually beneficial both for the developer and the community. Look forward to the conversation.
Amazing. Thank you, Tony, for kind of teeing up the slew of issues that we'll ideally dig into with the next 45 minutes. It just feels woefully short. Nevertheless, we're going to pass it to Steve Clemmer with the Union of Concerned Scientists to talk a little bit about the grid and energy impacts.
All right, thanks, Joe. And I have a couple of slides here to just share some of the findings and recommendations from our recent study. So let me share my screen here. Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so in my intro, Joe had mentioned some research that I led. This report we released in January, national level analysis of the impact of data centers on the electricity system. And we did some state level work as well that I'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. And so I'll also talk about what implications that this has for Maine, and we can discuss some of more of those things in detail when we get to the Q&A. But I also want to be clear about what we didn't look at in this study. We did not look at the local economic and environmental impacts of siting data centers that we think are really important and will also require strong guardrails. We also don't address important questions about the broader role and societal value of AI, as Tony was touching on. So when we released this report, is at a time when energy affordability and increasing electricity costs have been getting a lot of attention and become a major political issue. 46 states and the District of Columbia saw higher electricity costs between November 2024 and 2025, with average costs increasing by nearly 7% nationally across all sectors. States that are in the darker shades of green in this map saw the greatest increases. A near doubling of fossil gas prices and increasing climate damages to the grid, along with other investments in the transmission and distribution system, were key drivers to these increases nationally, but also especially in the state of Maine. However, we also have evidence that data centers are contributing to cost increases in areas where they are heavily concentrated, such as the Mid-Atlantic states, which had the highest cost increases of up to 26% over this time period. Our report shows that data centers could result in much greater cost increases in the future without strong ratepayer protections. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's attacks on renewable energy and energy efficiency are moving us in the wrong direction, while also risking more pollution, health, and climate impacts. And our analysis makes clear just how much is at stake. Since future data center demand growth is highly uncertain, we model multiple demand growth and energy policy scenarios using a power sector planning model developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And here are 5 key findings from the analysis. First, with stronger policies, the US can meet electricity demand from data centers primarily with clean energy while also phasing down fossil fuel use. Second, data center growth puts ratepayers at risk of large cost increases. We found that without ratepayer protections, rapid data center growth could put households and businesses at risk of more than $500 billion in cumulative electricity costs nationally by 2035 and nearly $1 trillion by 2050. Overall, costs could be about 4% or $250 billion lower by restoring federal clean energy tax credits that were slashed by Congress and the Trump administration last year. Absent strong policies, we found that additional fossil fuel use that would be burned to power data centers could increase power plant carbon dioxide emissions by nearly 20% and result in $1.6 trillion in cumulative climate and health damages over the next decade. The climate and health benefits of reducing fossil fuel use outweigh the costs of transitioning to clean energy. We found that by nearly decarbonizing the power sector by 2050 would result in more than $13 trillion in avoided climate and health damages. And finally, forward-looking policies can help avoid the health and environmental harms associated with the unmitigated growth of data centers. So let me get to the recommendations. In the report, we make 6 recommendations that are targeted at policymakers, regulators, utilities, and big tech companies. Many of these recommendations will require implementation at the state and local level, but the federal government also has a key role to play. Overall, we believe that unmitigated data center growth should not continue in the absence of stronger policies and guardrails, given the consequences for energy affordability, reliability, public health, and the climate are so high. So our recommendations fell into 3 main buckets. First was to protect ratepayers from cost increases by requiring data centers to pay for any additional electricity costs. And this can be implemented through state public utility commissions who can hold utilities and big tech companies accountable. And that should be based on firm commitments of financial backing from data center customers. State PUCs can also require utilities to develop rate structures that protect other customers from cost increases. And in Maine, the Public Utility Commission just opened a docket on this issue to explore them in more detail in response to the executive order that Governor Mills passed around creating the Data Center Advisory Council. The second bucket relates to increased transparency and accountability that Tony was touching on. This is a big issue that crosses multiple issues, but under this topic, state PUCs can also reduce uncertainty in forecasting load growth by requiring utilities to develop long-range plans that include projected demand from data centers, other large loads, and electrification. And it's worth noting that CMP, Central Maine Power, and Versant's grid plans that were recently filed with the PUC do not include any data center load growth. That may need to be reconsidered in future plans. The state legislatures and Congress should also require data centers and utilities to publicly report power needs, emissions, water use, and other impacts. with enough advance notice for communities to make informed decisions. And local officials should avoid signing non-disclosure agreements with data center developers that Tony was touching on as well. Policies supporting the development of data centers should also include standards and guardrails to protect public health and reduce environmental impacts in local communities. And this can be accomplished through state and local permitting, ordinances, and zoning. And finally, the third bucket relates to adopting stronger clean energy policies to help avoid or minimize the build out of fossil fuels to power data centers. Fortunately, Maine has strong clean energy and climate policies in place, but there are barriers to implementation that will need to be overcome. As I mentioned earlier, restoring federal tax credits and investing in new transmission, energy efficiency, and demand flexibility are also important. State PUCs and legislatures can also require big tech companies to acquire clean energy to meet data center demand, and importantly for local communities to use energy storage instead of diesel or gas generation as backup to reduce emissions and public health impacts on local communities. And finally, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission should require regional grid operators to reform interconnection processes to treat all resources fairly, as well as to increase transmission capacity to deliver more clean power to customers. Before I close, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the other state-based analyses that we've done. We have staff that are working on the ground in Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We've also done reports for Louisiana and California, where there's active data center proposals being moving forward. We're using the results and the recommendations from these analyses to advocate for stronger data center policies, regulations, and safeguards, and I think these could be useful to consider in Maine. We're also evaluating federal data center policy proposals and involved in regulatory efforts at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and with regional grid operators in certain parts of the country. Sorry. So I'll end there. Thank you. There's a couple of links here to our report, as well as a blog series that we've done on the cost of the AI boom. So I'll pass it back to you, Joe.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. I think it's one of those things that when a facility is measured in its kind of electrical impact load, to not have that be a part of the conversation in terms of full policy fixes and it deserves a deeper dive. So thank you so much for providing that. Now we'll toss it to Anja Collette in Bangor. Bangor, I believe, was the first city in the state, city or town in the state, to pass its own temporary limitation moratorium on data centers developed within the municipality. And we'd love to hear more about it. So Anja.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Grow Smart Maine, for having me. I'll be fairly brief because it was honestly a pretty short process, us passing a moratorium. But basically, early on this year, we kind of saw everything that was happening in other communities. And I was talking with some of the communities around me who were thinking about data center regulations. And we were like, we should probably, get on top of this ASAP. And so we were looking initially at doing regulations without a moratorium. And we had to also talk to our water district to get a sense of, what they felt like the impacts of a data center would be on water usage, if they felt like they had capacity for that sort of thing. And they did have, pretty significant concerns. So we started off by basically taking a memo to council, kind of outlining all of those concerns, outlining the issues other communities had experienced with data centers, and then basically did an outline of what potential regulations could look like, basically like a menu of options based on what research I had done, what other communities had done, and then, APA resources on data center zoning, things like that. And council, almost all of them were also very concerned about the impacts, and they were amenable to us going forward with those regulations. Around that time, we did start receiving kind of informal inquiries about data centers and where they might be possibly located in Bangor, where they would be allowed to be located. So based on that, we kind of felt like, we should probably go ahead and at least propose a moratorium before we get a formal application. And so we did take that to council, and they felt good with going in that direction. So we just took some sample ordinances, moratorium ordinances from other communities, and worked with our legal staff to finalize that. And we went to council, and given the pressure we were feeling, we did ask council to, typically we have to do ordinance changes in 2 readings, but they were able to waive that with a 2/3 vote. So they passed it the first night. And so our plan now is to work on drafting those regulations over the summer, since that moratorium ends this fall. And the timing actually works out really well for us because we're in the middle of overhauling our land development code. And so we're working with consultants to do that. And they're drafting the data center regulations as a separate piece. And so we'll be working with them on that. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for the history there. So I think we're going to kick into kind of question and answer period here. I have several prepared questions that I'll ask the panelists, but I noted it in the chat earlier. If you guys have questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat. I also pushed out that question submission form a little bit, whatever, earlier today, but also earlier this week. And we'll be using some of those questions for the next 15 minutes or so. So if you hear anything that sparks your interest, please feel free to either raise your hand, throw it in the chat. Would love to kind of open it up to conversation. One of the things that I want to kind of start with, one of the questions I want to start with actually relates to something that Tony has written before, which is that the central question is not simply whether data centers are good or bad, but how benefits and risks get allocated, and what forms of governance, local authority, and planning and transparency can help local leaders maximize the local benefits while protecting community interests. And I was curious, Tony, if you could just speak a little bit more in depth, provide any examples or pieces that you might have heard from other places, from the states that you're working in, just to give that a little thing.
Yeah. So again, because a lot of the work that I do focuses on community economic development in rural places, I'm going to focus, my answer primarily rural. But look, I'm in Washington, D.C., right? And I'm not too far from Loudoun County, Virginia, which we know is Data Center Alley. They're known for, a lot of data center development. Loudoun itself on the eastern side was kind of suburbanizing, but on the western side is actually still pretty rural as a county. And they had a significant amount of data center development. It happened and started to happen in a place where it had been planned for, and what it was, was zoned for sort of the types of warehouses that were housing the centers that we're in. In terms of revenue, the county takes in almost 900 for 2025, took in almost 900 million in a $940 million budget. And so almost entirely of its discretionary budget sort of coming in from that sort of development. And it's much cheaper for them. Like I've talked to a supervisor there. He said, look, it costs the county about 4 cents for every dollar of tax revenue, where most businesses, it's at least 25 cents for every dollar. And for residential, it's even more, right? So once they're in and they're underway, it's kind of a footprint that, seems like it's cost effective. And there are rural places, for example, in the Pacific Northwest, where they've had data centers for a while. You've got a place like Pineville, Oregon, where Meta's been for 15 years, and it's been continually expanding. So, there's just differences. It was a slow build out, right? Versus the accelerated build out that's happening, even though they have a very large footprint. Those very large footprints are trying to happen, much quicker now with AI. But they've seen huge reductions in unemployment. They've gone from almost 20% unemployment to below 5%. They've seen large increases in wages. rebirth of the downtown. You could say the same for Quincy, Washington, where Microsoft's been for a while. Now they've got abundant hydropower. They've got it's again a different place. And I think that's, all the different dimensions that we're talking about here. Siting, energy and power, water resources, the process itself by which it happens, and the deal itself. The extent to which you're working with a developer that's willing to invest in the community and in an accountable way. Those are just all real important considerations. So I can give you plenty of examples on the other side where it's getting dropped into communities at a moment's notice without the community really having time to work through whether the siting and whether the resources and the management of those resources are just going to actually provide too much disruption to the community's integrity that it even belongs there. And the extent to which, the balance of some increase in jobs, the increase in revenue, but what's going to happen to the community even while it's being built are worth it. I was talking to a radio host from North Dakota just a couple of weeks ago, and they're not too far away from a place that is seeing a data center go in, and it's just been incredibly disruptive to the infrastructure there. The roads are torn up, the noise. So that's during the construction phase, and they're worried about what it's going to mean over the long term for that particular community. And unless the community has been really part of the decision making around it and where the siting and what the benefits might be, I think it's going to be very difficult for it to look like a net positive for a community. Having said that, I think especially some of the publicly traded companies want to have a great relationship with the host communities and invest in those communities. And if the siting's right and, the other considerations are taken into account in a way in which the community is really shaping that, it could be a good thing for a community as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
I'd like to tap into something first of all. I want to make sure that we don't have a race to the bottom. AI data centers, they have massive amount of money. The Sanford one alone has 2.2 billion. Okay, just in Sanford location alone, they have a race to get to their data centers operational. Whether it's an AI data center or otherwise, they have the money. There should be no TIFs. There should be no incentives. Besides, we do not undervalue ourselves, and we should only be allowing them to be forced to be a B Corp, and only in a PFAS area: Loring, Sanford, and Jay. And then those three locations are a tri-ring trifecta to back up Virginia and Texas. It's all about infrastructure, fiber dynamics to connect to the rest of the world. It's all connected. If they're not B Corp, and if they're not in those three locations, they should not be in here. And the rest of those locations in Bangor or otherwise, they should be part of housing, of data centers in housing or in the corporate municipality, so that town hall or whatever can be off the grid. It's not even considered a data center at that point. They're just on their own sovereign data. That's it. Don't race
Yeah.
to the bottom.
Yeah. Thank you for adding that. And you did bring up something that I thought was interesting, and I'm curious to just direct this towards Anja maybe. As you're thinking about like the kind of follow-up to the moratorium and developing some rules, regulations around development in the future, is TIF something you've talked about, tax abatement? Is that in the conversation at this point? And if so, like, what does that look like? And maybe where's the city at? But generally speaking, what are those conversations like? And
there's definitely been no discussion as far as I'm aware of tax incentives. Definitely our council is leaning more towards let's put every regulation possible on them. So yeah, and as far as honestly, I think the state would have to empower us to do this. But I read about something that another community out of state did where they actually charged a way higher tax rate on data center equipment and put that money into affordable housing. I think, you know, some communities might view that favorably, but just an idea.
Also,
Yeah.
they should be water free. It should be in if LD comes back next year and LD 307, a version of that comes back in January, it should be water free. If it's not B Corp mandated, it should be water free mandated. And by the way, Freelancing Factory and the Loring Data Center are the first water free ones. Data centers, and out of all of Maine and New England, Freelancing Factory is the only one that has the participation and authorization dealership rights for the water-free equipment from Liquid Cool Solutions, who have over 72 patents related to that one. So we are the center of water-free globally, and we hold the rights for all of New England. So anyone that has to be water-free also comes to us, which keeps it all money in Maine and not Minnesota and Wisconsin, where Liquid Cool Solutions is actually originated. Keep that in mind as well. And Freelancing Factory has a team of bench of 11,000 plus freelancers that we can also incentivize to move to Maine exactly where we want, when we want, how we want, when it comes to the housing. So Rustic and getting the congestion away from York County, get that up. Hold on one second.
Hey, Mac, thank you.
We just get
Yeah,
the congestion from Franklin County. Uh, Cumberland and York, all the way to Franklin, Aroostook, and the other counties in Washington, especially. And if we use data centers the right way, then we can actually pay off the municipality privately without legislation for Washington County. They have a massive debt that needs to be taken care of. And I will personally take care of that debt if the options arise.
okay. Yeah, Mac, thank you. Thank you for your input. I'll just add that if folks want to add in to the conversation, just to raise your hands before you do so, and jump in. So, thanks. Tony, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, Joe, just to come in. So I think the point that communities often have more leverage than they think they do is an important point. Developers are coming in because of they see an opportunity in a confluence of siting and resources and power and those other things. And so, you know, I would also suggest that it doesn't have to be a race to the bottom. And there's also mechanisms to, that developers and companies and others can be engaged on. Like you could be creating community funds, for example, investments in a community foundation or set asides for the community to either be deciding upon what they might need for long-term benefit, or even upfront negotiating particular kinds of investments in schools or other kinds of programs that would be important. Across the country, even where you've had some tax abatements, you've made it part of a package where there are payments in lieu of taxes that might go to other things. You can also, inside a community benefits agreement, you could be putting things like, buy local provisions. You could be creating a small business or even a supply chain kind of development of value chain of businesses. So you've got initial financing for other businesses to be cited. There's lots of creative ways to go about it. And I think communities often have more leverage. What they don't have often is access to the kind of legal, engineering, even community engagement expertise. And that's a very asymmetrical situation. And I think that's another thing to be keeping in mind. And, one of the things that I would be interested in seeing states do is putting together like SWAT teams that can go out and work with local communities where you get the influx of the kind of expertise that can help you put the community's interests on the table at sort of a symmetrical way with the developer and the customer's interest at the table as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it makes me wonder about kind of the interplay between communities and state policy. And the moment that we're kind of in, which consists of the Data Center Coordination Council being convened, and they're currently meeting. Their first meeting was yesterday, and they're looking for these ideas, mostly to find ways to build guardrails. But I do wonder, and this is a question for Anya again. I wonder about like what are the kind of tools and resources that would be really helpful 2 planning offices right now, and even in smaller towns that are just made available by the state, whether that's through MOCA or whether that's a coalition of nonprofits who are getting together and thinking about these things. I wonder that, and if there's any kind of like set of things that would be really helpful as you think about
Um,
creating your own set of rules.
yeah, I mean, I guess I was going to propose kind of a version of what Tony said. I mean, having technical assistance for municipalities to generate ordinances and helping provide feedback and helping them determine, what they can legally do and what zoning can do versus what are other tools they have. I think all of that would be important, and even a model ordinance, although, every community is going to be probably pretty different with how they want to approach things. But um, yeah, I think that really covers it. I mean, as far as what we're going to be doing, I'm really just going to be relying on the resources out there online for like APA, like I mentioned, and then what other communities have done, looking at their ordinances, especially places that have a lot of data centers like Fairfax, Virginia. I went to the National Planning Conference recently, and some other communities that have had a big influx are like Cheyenne, Wyoming, a lot of places out west. So I'm probably going to be just looking pretty heavily at their ordinances. So
Yeah. And I just wanted to involve Steve in this conversation back. I see you have your hand up. I just wanted to ask one more question and get Steve into the conversation around some of the clean energy stuff that we talk about here in the state, some of the plans that you've been helpful in helping to create, and this idea of like what benefits could be accrued by communities, but also by the state as it relates to clean energy. And it's been talked about in other places, this kind of idea that it could almost go a couple different ways here in terms of meeting demands imposed by data centers. Um, but like, what does that kind of clean energy advocacy look like at the community level, at the state level? What does that future look like in terms of creating, meeting the state's goals and getting off of diesel and these types of things?
Yeah, thanks for that. There's definitely roles that both the state and the local communities can play in deploying clean energy. I think, as I mentioned, Maine has strong climate and clean energy laws. There's a requirement to get to 90% of Maine's electricity from renewable energy by 2030 and 100% from clean energy by 2040. That's a law. And the, most of that would be implementation at the state level. The PUC and the Maine legislature really would need to require data centers to procure clean energy, and that's going to be necessary to meet the state's climate and energy goals. If we build gas plants, it's going to be very challenging to do that. And it's also important to note that utilities do not own generation in the state of Maine. The Department of Energy Resources and the PUC are responsible for clean energy procurement, at least for utility scale procurement. Big tech companies can also sign power purchase agreements with developers, but again, those would need to be approved by the PUC and coordinated with utilities. Tony mentioned this concept of bring your own energy, or we like to say bring your own clean energy. And we're very supportive of that, but I will say that there's also significant limitations about requiring that energy to be co-located on site, especially for larger data centers. There's just simply not enough space usually and it might not be the best place to deploy some of these resources. So we think an approach that, covers sort of a broader area would make a lot more sense and would be lower cost than requiring it all to be co-located at the site. As far as local communities go, obviously, like the permitting issues are really important, and all the stuff we've been talking about related to ordinances and zoning and so forth. From a clean energy perspective, I think local communities will need to sort of encourage clean energy deployment and could maybe even encourage customer sited deployment or community solar type projects. But there has been a barrier across the US of local communities adopting moratoriums and bans or overly stringent ordinances on wind and solar projects that have effectively um, led to moratoriums. So that, is something that would, I would hope we would avoid and, encourage responsible development of renewables, but not have overly stringent restrictions that would prevent them from going forward. I think just one other point quickly to Tony's point about community benefits agreements, I think those could be used to help provide funding and incentives for local renewables and energy efficiency, virtual power plants, things like that. And those mechanisms could also, I've also seen those adopted either through some of the utility proceedings or through state legislative state state laws have been passed around data centers to have big tech companies support state energy efficiency programs and things like that. So those are a couple of ways.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Mac, you have a question.
Not a question, statement of fact. So I'll start with the community benefits agreement that Tony and Steve went into. So as part of having the water-free solution and equipment that only we have, for Sanford and Jay Centers, we've actually made it so that in order to get our water-free equipment, they also have to have a community benefits agreement. So every 1 billion that they have invested in their project, so Sanford's 2.2, we've enforced a 20 million. So 1 billion for equals 10 million. So $20 million for just Sanford alone as a community benefits agreement. Now that's also because they have a massive influx of housing or population that is camped out on there. So they have a massive homeless population there. So that is to increase the housing and all that, build the housing, as well as create a pipeline from Sanford to Loring for that housing, so that it helps them on relieving that encampment there, while also getting that PFAS. So it should be not just for, we should never be going to gas, because that's only going to increase our gas prices for the winter for our normal consumers. And then we should be using these three locations, Loring J and Sanford, as the true hubs. It's a hub and spoke model. Everything else and the rest of Maine is just a spoke to those three hubs. Now, to further on that, when you mentioned Anja, you mentioned community municipality, like a task force that could go in there. Now, Freelancing Factory already has that for GovCon commercial, as well as municipality, where it's kind of like a bar rescue, where we go in and we diagnose, audit, and actually have the operation system and now the data sovereignty to add into that. And then this is before we even touch into our Wabanaki connections. But check out the links that I put into the chat here for LinkedIn. That's all about our data centers, as well as my patent, as how my patent can keep those data centers in check, and transparency as a governance, as well as water with accountability as a service as well. So we take that water wars going on that was started in '92 with the Dublin Accords, that the data centers are now exasperating. Sorry, my dyslexia is getting in the way. Trying to get the time management for you guys. So we've got all that taken care of. Just take a look at that on the LinkedIn, and you guys would be better off with knowing what's truly being audited right now by DARPA and everything else. Maine Angels is behind us. We're about to have a James Murray style skills-based contest for the state of Maine for the whole world to red team and peer review the patent as well. And that's going to bring a lot of attention to Maine as a center and the capital of inference. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mac. That's all super insightful, and thank you for sharing both what you're doing, but also kind of speaking about some of the general framework for how we should be thinking about maybe some of the data center development stuff here in the state. I have a couple other questions that I just want to get to. Um, and one of them actually has to do with the kind of role that local economic developers play. In which and I'll just read the question, but how can local economic developers work with data center applicants and the inevitable NDAs and loaded upfront conversations on these projects, i.e., doing their jobs as professionals without running afoul of their select boards and city councils and the public? And the person who submitted this question just noted there have been cases in which these projects have placed staffs in impossible positions, and I'm curious if anyone has anything to say.
I mean, I would recommend that they go to council ahead of time and talk to them about data centers and the public, get their thoughts. What kind of guardrails do people want to see? I think having that early upfront communication first is important. And then ideally, you would also get your regulations in place too. So that's done.
My suggestion would be if you understand the definition of a B Corp, not an S Corp
Ma
or a C Corp, B
Hey,
Corp,
Mac,
that
I'm going to ask that if you want to chip in, you raise your hands, and then we go that way. Thank you.
look, simple as B Corp.
Um,
That's it, sir.
Jim, I see you have your hand up.
Oh yeah. Great conversation, by the way. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so and I'll be brief. By the way, because I can't remember the different presenters. It might have been Steve, if I may, but if I got it wrong, about really pointing out that it's not a yes no type thing. It's not a binary type thing necessarily. It's really about understanding both like what the project is, because the projects are very different in terms of data centers. There's all kinds of data centers. Secondly, there's all kinds of costs associated with them. And there's also potential kinds of benefits that are different. And additionally, like no different than a gigantic warehouse or a paper mill or a food manufacturer, they're not meant for every place. Like I wouldn't put one of these necessarily in downtown Freeport, just as one example, right? So there's definitely like a lot of considerations. So from the economic development question, which is the question on the table now, just speaking as someone who consults with economic developers across the country, and in fact, I've done a lot of work both for Loudoun County and Prince William County in terms of their economic plans and considering data centers. Just a couple of things I want to add is you do really need to look at, like, you need to do land analysis about the highest and best use of your land to see if it's going to be crowding out other uses. And because that comes into play as well in terms of what else do you want to use the land for. So that's number one. Number two is on those betterment agreements and thinking about it, there is also ways to work with the data centers around how can I grow and ignite some of my tech opportunities in the area. They're not going to do that necessarily on their own. Tech companies do not have to be located next to data centers. That was like an early myth around data centers. But they can absolutely be part of it, particularly if they want to grow and be part of your ecosystem and be a good neighbor, if you will. The other thing is, I do like that there's a lot of people on this call that are sort of pointing this out. It really does, while there's role for state, absolutely a role for state, it really does come down to like some local decisions. I would hate to see the state making a decision for Sanford or Limestone or areas where they really have thought it through and really could use this kind of economic development subject to parameters. And then, but we just put, a ban on it per se, or we do a one size fits all. Um, and the other final thing I'll say is, particularly around, and this was mentioned before, if some of your economic development goals and your community development goals are also how to create more renewables, how to like integrate batteries into your system, which are going to benefit more than just data centers, then that's also becomes what else can we leverage this data center for? And again, I'm not at all putting aside the environmental, the water, and the energy concerns, which also need to be vetted. My last comment, because I know we don't have a lot of time, is Anja from Bangor was saying this. I'm sorry if I got your first name wrong, but the about you got to like think about it early. I would absolutely say that about economic development to begin with. In other words, do not wait for a data center to be proposed. Start having discussions about data centers and other kinds of development that are also happening about what will you say yes to, how will we accommodate it, what do we want to get out of it, and do that well in advance of a project coming so that like you're not just reacting and going on passion and that kind of thing. So I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to end it there.
Thanks, Jim. Tony, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of reactions to some of the things Jim was saying, and also the conversation with Anja a little bit before. So one thing just to realize is that this has happened really fast. And so even like the networks at the National Association of Counties or National League of Cities, they're playing catch up in being able to provide a lot of good peer opportunities and connections across the board with where people have had experience and people don't have experience, but they're getting there. And so I think there will also be some, more opportunities instead of those being, self-driven and self-identified. You're going to see more and more opportunities of people starting to exchange at the both the planning and decision-making level. Just to Jim's point on state preemption, that can go a lot of different ways. You can have states preemption by saying we're going to ban it all, or you can have states preemption over local decision making, where like West Virginia has passed a law where it's actually the states making the decision rather than the local communities. Because of the concern about competing and being able to, act really quickly. And I think they're getting a lot of pushback from local communities on that. And personally, I would say rightly so. Also because of the revenue that they're taking actually even on the sites that are going in. And that's one thing that we don't have a good, clear sense of. Like we just did a symposium for the commission that I'm running on data centers. It's very hard to find good analysis of how different states are approaching these particular issues. And there's a lot of variation state to state on what state policies are. And I think there's a question mark on what constitutes a race to the bottom in kind of state policies and how they're approaching it. I would also say to Jim's point, there, planning up front is certainly the way to go. My worry, especially because a lot more of these are landing in rural places, is a lot of rural places have very limited administrative capacity. They don't have plans in place for a reason. They don't have a lot of administrative capacity to sort of get that planning in place. They might not even have an economic development director, right? They've got local elected officials that are primarily volunteer. Those guys have other jobs. And so that's a big tension that I'm seeing right now, because you're seeing where I grew up in north central Pennsylvania, in town of 1800, town 10 minutes down the road is seeing 4 data centers proposals. It is a former coal town that is now a persistent poverty community over the last 30 years. And, they would love to have planned for all this, but they don't have the capacity to be able to sit down and run that process and have it in place. But I totally agree with Jim that if you can do it, that's what you ought to be thinking about and doing, because it'll mitigate a lot of the conversation that happens in a very accelerated and abrupt fashion.
Thank you, Tony. Anja.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to kind of respond to that a little. I mean, that's why we put in a moratorium, so we would have time to develop those regulations. Because, even though we are a city, like we have resources and myself as a planner, and we have, consultants that we're working with, we still don't have a lot of time. We're very busy, and we really needed extra time to make sure that we had a good set of regulations in place. And so I would say even a smaller community should consider a moratorium so they can have time. Maybe they can go out and find a consultant that would help them if they have it in their budget. But I also think that is where the state technical assistance would be really helpful too. So.
And just to come back on that, Anja, it's exactly what they did after they got overwhelmed with about 100 people at a community meeting. They put 180-day moratorium on.
I want to honor this question that came through in the question submission, but it's also in the chat now, that relates to if there will be independent, unbiased resources to analyze actual workforce impacts or feasible growth. I also think this is an interesting conversation about all of the impacts, where it's like, what are the bodies that are doing some analysis and looking at these numbers in an unbiased way. And I'm curious, I know, Tony, your organization just put out an employment kind of report. I'm curious if there are other organizations out there.
Michael Hicks at Ball State has been doing an analysis on local labor market implications from the Texas data centers. because they're a bit more mature. But again, they were more primarily cloud data centers versus, what's happening now. Partly what's difficult is that a lot of it's happening so quickly. And it's hard to find the sample set of like, especially for permanent jobs. So construction jobs, you can, start to analyze, and that's what Danny and my other colleagues at Brookings were also doing as well. I will be honest and say though, like when we were putting our symposium together, uh, the landscape of research is dominated by industry because that's who's trying to move and that's the market, and so they're doing the studies and they're funding a lot of studies. Sort of what I would say third party analysis is catching up, is primarily in catch up mode.
I see that in Steve's great work with the Union of Concerned Scientists around all of this too. It's like there are absolutely third-party organizations that are looking into this. But yeah, that's something that I've noticed as well, where the slower to catch up. Um, Mac, I see you have your hand raised. I welcome you to email me a question, but we are
Quick
3 minutes
question, Joe.
past. We're
You guys are mentioning about bias, and my patent is literally bias mitigation and decision distortion. It is the third party that doesn't
okay.
need any human. It's human in the loop
Thank,
as well. You guys just need to study that, and it's already there. But we do need
okay.
to go into
Thank you.
what you're doing. It's a
Yeah.
thermal pipeline. Data centers need
Thank
to
you,
be a
Mac.
thermal pipeline.
So I have a feedback form that is in the chat right now. If you would please give it 5 minutes of your time, just to give us some feedback about how this webinar went, if you got something out of it, and where we should go next with these conversations. Obviously, an hour was not long enough to talk about all of the things that we want to talk about, and this is an evolving field of study for certain, but also as the state evolves, as these proposals evolve, so will the conversations. And so really welcome any feedback that you have for us as we look ahead at what to do next. And I really want to thank Anja and Tony and Steve for being here with us and lending their time and their expertise to this conversation. So thank you so much. We'll see you soon.